I've been thinking about it, and I think there is a very real possibility that this year, 2023, will go down as, up till now at least, the best year in gaming ever. I know that's kind of a lofty thing to say, right? Because there have been a lot of amazing years in the past. And it's something that I've been thinking about lately because when talking to people about, how good releases have been this year, I feel like that's just a sentiment that's been lightly welling up. And so I decided to go back and look at some of the previous years that oftentimes get highly regarded as strong years for games. And while there are some absolutely wonderful ones, and some of this is of course up to debate depending on the type of games you're into, what stuff was a big deal for you, but just when looking in terms of the full lineup of games that are coming out this year, it is an extraordinarily stacked list, both for things like new IPs, new sequels to major franchises that have been around for a little while, taking a look at ports and remasters and remakes, new ways of making some popular older games available on modern hardware. It is just an extremely dense list, which, makes a little bit of sense considering the past couple years of slightly slower releases. I mean, really, right now, as of recording this video, we're basically just at the start of July, so we're at the halfway point of the year. And when you look at the full list of everything that is released so far, as well as what is left and what has been recently announced for closing the year out with, obviously there's always room for some of those games maybe being not as good as we're hoping for, but if even 60% of them live up to the potential that a lot of them have been showing off, it feels like this is going to end up being a very difficult year for any other one to compare with. And really, if you just look back at what's already released in the first half of the year, we're having a lot of entries in major franchises, some of which are already being regarded as some of the best in their franchise. Earlier this year, we had Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which did get a little bit of mixed reception due to its performance at launch, particularly on console, but as far as the reception of the content itself goes, and the storytelling and the gameplay has all been extremely positive. Tears of the Kingdom, of course, is a huge deal for fans of The Legend of Zelda, taking the base building blocks of Breath of the Wild and turning it into something I think even bigger than a lot of people realized pre-launch, especially with the building mechanics. Street Fighter VI is an excellent new addition to the franchise, and I think one of the big takeaways with that one is how well it's managed to be not only just a new solid entry in the Street Fighter franchise, but is also one of the most accessible ones in the series, thanks to having a lot more learning tools and the new modern control options. Final Fantasy XVI just came out, which, yeah, there's a little bit of debate in terms of some people being like whether or not this counts as a true Final Fantasy game, but whatever. That whole argument aside, the game itself that we actually got is incredible. Diablo 4, also from this past month, is walking a really nice balance of bringing back some of the flavor and stylings of the very legendary Diablo 2, while at the same time giving it a really nice action and more accessible focus that Diablo 3 kind of leaned into a bit, acting as this balance point of, I think, bringing the best of both worlds together. Octopath Traveler 2, a sequel to the original Octopath Traveler that, to be honest, the first game I always loved in concept, but didn't really click with me quite right, whereas 2 really felt like it addressed and fixed all the different things with one that just made it a little rough around the edges, and ended up being, to me, one of my favorite games of this year that I honestly did not expect to be as quality as it ended up being. And while not my personal game in the franchise, I do also got to shout out Fire Emblem Engage, because while story and writing wise definitely I think falls off a little bit compared to some past games, it has some of the best tactical combat in the series to date. And then when you take a look at the ports, remakes, and remasters of all the games that happened this year, a personal favorite of mine, Like a Dragon Ishin, a title that never actually originally released in the West, made its way over finally with a big upgrade in the visual department and plays wonderfully. I think it's a great way of experiencing the franchise for the first time if you've been a little intimidated by how large the mainline series is. Resident Evil 4 Remake is something that we've been waiting on for a while and absolutely delivered on a tight action horror experience that I think, doesn't completely replace the original experience, but also opens up the game to a new way of gameplay that is just quite simply a ton of fun. In a similar vein, the original Dead Space got a remake that added a little bit more narrative and plot in terms of actually giving Isaac a voice in this version, but while still maintaining the vibes, feelings, and aesthetic of the original version. Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp finally came out after numerous delays, for somewhat of a very good reason, and one of the other wonderful surprises we got this year, the Metroid Prime Remaster. The System Shock remake finally came out, Ghost Trick had a revealed and now recently released remake come out, which is a huge deal to me. I mean, I understand why some people don't always want to necessarily lean super hard into only focusing on the remakes and remasters that happened this year, but there are so many wonderful titles that now have a breath of fresh air to them on modern systems. And honestly, when you just look at which games are being remade, I just feel like this year is a greatest hits of past titles brought to life again. And the thing is, with how many established franchises did well this year, we also got got some really pleasant new surprises as far as new IPs go. The developers behind Nioh introduced their new game Wolong, which does follow a little bit in the footsteps, but does go in its own direction as well. Obviously, is a very different aesthetic, relying on a different culture. And Hi-Fi Rush to me is one of the most pleasant surprises of this year because it was shadow dropped out of absolutely nowhere and feels like something that almost comes from a previous era of gaming where it's this just more short, focused, labor of love style of game that I fell in love with. And that's all the stuff that's just already released during the first half of the year. Again, when we look at the back half, obviously there's no guarantee that every single game is going to live up to its full potential, but there are so many that just show so much promise. Pikmin 4, Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, Armored Core 6, Mortal Kombat 1, Lies of P, Assassin's Creed is going back to its roots with Assassin's Creed Mirage, Alan Wake 2, Spider-Man 2, we're getting a new 2D Mario game with a wonderful art style in Super Mario Wonder, Super Mario RPG is getting a remake, we're getting another Like a Dragon game with the side story The Man Who Erased His Name, WarioWare is finally bringing back another motion-focused game, and there's a couple more personal favorite ones that may not be the biggest titles, but I think are awesome to happen this year, like we're getting a remake of Star Ocean: The Second Story that looks wonderful, and Disney Illusion Island is shaping up to be an incredible family-focused Metroidvania-style game. And while there is a chance that some of this stuff could get delayed into early next year, there's also the chance that there's titles we've heard and talked about that have not gotten hard release dates yet that might end up still dropping this year. I think a really big example of this is the hope that Tekken 8 actually manages to drop, because if it does, that makes this year for fighting games absolutely wild between Street Fighter 6, Mortal Kombat 1, and that. And I think the thing that's really interesting about how strong this year has been is how much of it is third-party supported. Not to say that first-party haven't had their strong releases either. Obviously, Sony has Spider-Man 2 in the back half of the year. Xbox has got both Forza and Starfield to look forward to. Nintendo in particular, I think, is having a very good year between some of the remakes and remasters they revealed this year, Tears of the Kingdom, new Mario Wonder near later on in the year. But a lot of the total list is really made up of a lot of third-party companies between people like Capcom, Bandai Namco, Square Enix, Sega, and Atlas. It just feels like a lot of these companies are having this jam-packed year of releasing a lot of stuff all at once, which also makes a lot of sense, honestly, when you kind of look back at the history of when we've had very strong years for different generations of systems. It's somewhere normally in the kind of 3 to 4 year area after consoles release, because it feels like a lot of devs are entering that phase where a lot of projects that were in development at the start of the generation really start to fully release. And when you look back at, say, the PS1 and N64, 96 through 98 are actually all very good years. It's an amazing trio when you actually look at everything that came out within those three all together. 98, though, in particular, I think is a very strong one to look at. When you look at the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, 2004 was a really huge year as far as all the games that came out. And as amazing as all those previous years have been, just when I look at the full makeup of what's been going on in 23, I feel like it's just going to end up dethroning all of those because of the sheer density of stuff. And that's not to say there haven't been some weak releases this year. Obviously, Golem was kind of a one big joke for a lot of people for a while. Redfall had a very mixed launch. But even with some of those weaker releases balancing it out, the sheer list of everything that has worked out well and what is on the horizon is incredible. And the thing is, when I'm talking about best years for gaming, I really am focusing entirely on just the games themselves. If you want to look at some other aspects of the gaming market, yeah, there are a few other things that have been slower. Hardware-wise, as far as the major companies go, it's definitely been something where Sony's being really active, but both Xbox and Nintendo are being pretty quiet. It seems like Xbox is not planning on doing any kind of mid-gen refresh, at least just yet, instead focusing on continuing to support the Series X and Series S. Nintendo, there's that hanging question of when their next hardware is going to be, which at this rate, I don't think we're going to see any reveal this year. Maybe it's just a light hinting and talking about it, but that is something that's definitely going to be more of a 24 or even early 25 kind of focus. Meanwhile, Sony launched PSVR 2 at the start of this year. We are more than likely getting a slim refresh at the end of this year. They've already revealed Project Q, which is something I'm a little bit more mixed on. So they've been active on the hardware side of things. I'm curious to see how the later two pan out. PSVR 2, I think, has some interesting software, but just needs a bigger library to support it. And so I think hardware overall is not going to be one of the big hallmarks of this year, but the game library, which in my mind is ultimately actually the most important part of this whole talk, is quality. And actually, as I talk about this, I realize that when I've been talking about the game library, I've really been primarily focusing on, what you would normally call either AAA or at least larger established companies. And if you look at the indie market this year, that's another factor where a lot of great stuff has released or is coming on its way very soon. One in particular that I have talked a lot about is Sea of Stars and how I'm excited for that. There's actually a few different RPG, Kickstarter, or small indie games that are releasing this year. We had Chain of Echoes earlier. I believe Iodine Chronicles Chronicle is still on track for this year, even though we haven't gotten a final release date just yet. Oxenfree 2 is finally releasing. Maybe there's that out of nowhere chance the Silksong actually happens this year, but who knows? Blasphemous 2 is happening. There's maybe a chance that Silksong could end up releasing this year. I don't know, fingers crossed. Maybe I just jinxed it by saying that. But the strength of this year really is something that I feel like is just across the board when it comes to established stuff, new stuff, and just smaller studio stuff. Obviously, there's also a lot of potential for what can happen next year, and I am always hoping that we just see things getting better and better, but I feel like 2023 is going to be a year that overall ends up spoiling us a lot because of just the sheer number of titles that have fully released. Some of this is some catch-up, because a lot of these games were probably planned for 22 or even 21 originally, but there were a lot of good reasons for games to get pushed back, kind of starting at when this generation began in 2020, and the payoff for a lot of them has finally happened, and I am just enjoying it so much. So I've just wanted to rant a bit about how incredible this year has been for gaming, and I think will end up shaping up to be by the end of it. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys later.